Hi friends, Father Carey here, and this is another Holy Spirit moment, asking the rather troubling question, why gods die. I'm thinking about this these days because I've been rereading Plutarch, the first century Greek author. Now, he's best known for his biographies of famous Latins and famous Greeks. But he was also an essayist who wrote scores of essays on topics ranging from biology to mythology. He was also, in the last 30 years of his life, he died around AD 119, a priest in the Delphic temple of Apollo. He was a priest of Apollo. And in 3 of his essays, they're known as the Delphic Dialogues, he asks himself what must have been a troubling question to him. Why are gods dying? Why is it that religious sensibilities seem to be on the wane? I think that that's a question that's very pertinent to the times in which you and I live. And so what I would like to do is to very briefly tell you what Plutarch has to say, and then see how it can shed light perhaps on our own situation. The first of these dialogues, what he calls the Delphic Dialogues, is entitled, Why Are Oracles No Longer in Verse? In previous days, says Plutarch, when the Pythian, the oracle at Delphi, the priestess at Delphi, would answer questions put to her, she would often answer them in cryptic verse, such that the person who asked for her advice may not have been quite sure what the advice was then when it was given. But these days, says Plutarch, when the Pythian priestess speaks, her answers are in straightforward prose. They're very prosaic. They're not very interesting. Why is that? What's changed? Well, according to Plutarch, what's changed is the kind of question that is typically being asked the priestess. In the past, the questions were about soul, or about destiny, or about the fate of nations or leaders. And now the questions that are being asked are, should I marry? How can I make my fortune? Should I go this way or that way in my career? And these questions don't deserve poetic responses, Plutarch seems to be suggesting, because the questions that are being posed dishonor the god by treating him as kind of a fortune teller, not an oracle. The second essay in this series of Delphic Dialogues is entitled On the Obsolescence of Oracles. And in this particular essay, what Plutarch is doing is taking head on the decline of religion in his day. There are fewer and fewer temples, he tells us. And part of the reason for that is that there are fewer and fewer priests and priestesses. There are fewer people who are interested in devoting themselves, their lives, to the gods. But there are also fewer and fewer worshipers, and that's why there are fewer and fewer priests and priestesses. And finally, Plutarch wonders, are the gods themselves dying? Do we have fewer temples and fewer oracles because there are fewer gods? And in that particular essay, in chapter 17, as a matter of fact, comes one of the most haunting tales out of the ancient world. You probably are familiar with it, if for no other reason Elizabeth Barrett Browning based one of her greatest poems upon it. In chapter 17 of On the Obsolescence of Oracles, Plutarch tells the story of a ship that is passing by the island of Paxi in the nighttime. And from the island comes a voice, and it calls for Thamus, who is the captain of the boat. And when Thamus responds, "Here I am," the voice says, "When you get to such and such a place, tell them that great Pan is dead." Tell them that the god Pan is dead, has died, is no more. And Plutarch takes that story as kind of a symptom of what's happening overall. Disbelief in gods is growing, and hence the influence and the very existence of the gods are dying. Now, he tries to bring all of this to a conclusion in the third of the 3 Delphic Dialogues, and the one I think, as a matter of fact, is the most interesting. And it's got a strange title, On the E at Delphi. On the letter E at Delphi. In the pronaos, in the portico of the temple at Delphi, many legends and sayings, maxims were inscribed. One of them was "Know thyself," a motto which Socrates took to heart, as we know from the Platonic dialogue, the Apology. But another was simply the letter E, or in Greek, ypsilon. It would have been pronounced A by the ancient Greeks. What in the world does that mean? Plutarch asks himself. In the dialogue, there are several voices that offer several different explanations. Some people say, well, it stands for the letter 5 because the Greek alphabet, just like the Hebrew alphabet, offers numerical qualities to the different letters. And ypsilon stands for number 5. And so it stands for 5, and that might mean the 5 sages of ancient Greece, or that might mean the 5 senses, or it might mean planets. Another person says, well, no, A can also mean in Greek if or only if. So what it means is that people are enjoined by the priestess, by the god, to use their reason. Because whenever you pose an argument, it goes something like, if A, then B. Only if A, then B. Yet a third person says, no, it's got something to do with Pythagoras, because for Pythagoras, the number 5 was sacred. But Plutarch himself points something else out. The sound A not only can mean if and only if, but it can also mean in ancient Greek, thou art. And that's what he takes the E to stand for. And this is what he has to say. Whenever people enter into the temple at Delphi, they are reminded that the God is, thou art. That's what they should be thinking when they enter the door of the temple. And to say thou art in reference to God is to affirm the absolute eternity of the deity, the absolute independence of the deity. Thou art is the very ground of being itself, dependent upon nothing, but everything is dependent upon it. It reminds me very much of what Yahweh tells Moses in the book of Genesis when Moses asks for God's name. God responds, you may recall, tell them I am who I am, which is a pun on the Hebrew word for being or to be. Plutarch says that the two mottos, know thyself and A, or the letter E, ypsilon, are complementary because in reminding ourselves as we walk through the temple door that God is the ground of being and absolute eternity, we are reminded of what we are, know thyself. We are dependent creatures who are constantly in flux, who are like the people that Heraclitus must have been thinking of when he said you can't step into the same river twice. Everything is constantly flowing in our lives. We recognize our fragility. We recognize our contingency. True religion marries those two intuitions, says Plutarch. We humans recognize our dependence upon God, while at the same time recognizing that God is absolutely independent, absolutely eternal, absolutely absolute, unlike ourselves. So the very reason then that Plutarch has to write this third essay on the E at Delphi is because he senses that people no longer know thou art when it comes to God and no longer know themselves. I wonder if something like that isn't going on with us today. Maybe that's why Christianity seems to be on the decline. Why do we ask God for the things we ask God for these days? Think of the first essay on why verse is no longer spoken from the oracle. We treat God as if God is a Santa God all too often, don't we? A genie in a bottle, and all we have to do is to incant the proper formula. We call them prayers, and God will give us what we want. And if God doesn't do that, then we become angry and turn our backs on God. Or how many times have we in our own way heard on the wind, the great God is dead? Nietzsche, of course, proclaimed that in the 19th century when he famously said that God is dead. But don't you and I too often act as if God is dead? We push God to the margins of our existence. God isn't in our midst in our everyday life. We may think of God once a week when we go to church, if we go to church, but that's about it. We no longer have a sense of the transcendent God. We no longer have a sense that there is a divine purposefulness that weaves through all of reality and upon which we depend. We are perhaps very much in the same kind of zeitgeist, in the same ethos as Plutarch found himself in the last years of the first century. You know, for us Christians, the cross is a symbol of sacrificial love, love of one another, love especially of our enemies. I wonder if in our churches, in addition to adorning them with crosses, we might not put up giant E's to remind us that God is, thou art. The 17th century painter, Nicolas Poussin, has a wonderful, wonderful painting. It's called The Ordination, in which he shows the Lord handing the keys to the kingdom to Peter. And there's a column to one side of the Lord, and it has a simple inscription on it, and it is nothing more than the letter E, Epsilon. And I think that what Poussin clearly is doing there is hearkening back to his own reading of Plutarch's essay and reminding the viewers of his portrait that no matter what we may think about God, God is transcendent. God is, thou art. God is he who is. I'm Father Carey Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment, really encouraging you to dig out on the E at Delphi. You can find it online and read it for yourselves. I think that it will be a good tonic for the kind of slippage in God belief that we seem to be experiencing these days. Take care. If you're of a mind, I invite you to subscribe. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.